There's a story in Tibet concerning two brothers, one of whom had 99 yaks, while the other had only one yak. A yak is, to a Westerner, cattle. The poor brother was quite content with his one yak. He was quite happy and thought he had great wealth. And he had one yak, and that was really all he needed. It was quite sufficient, and he wasn't particularly afraid of losing it. In fact, his enjoyment of owning it was greater than his fear of losing it. Whereas the other one was always very afraid of losing his yaks. He always had to look after them, and generally, you find in the highlands of Tibet that there is a lot of wolves and Himalayan mountain bears, and the yaks quite often die through the hardships of winter. There are far more obstacles there in this part of the world when it comes to looking after animals. So one day the rich brother thought, well, I think I'll ask my brother a favor. You see, he was not only afraid of losing his yaks, he was also very keen on accumulating more of them. And he went to the other brother and said, well, I know you have only one yak, which doesn't make much difference to you. So if you didn't have one at all, it wouldn't really matter very much either. But if you give me your yak, then I will have 100 yaks, which means a great deal to me. I mean, 100 yaks is really something. If I had that much, I would really be somebody rich and famous. And so he asked the favor. The other brother gave up the yak quite easily. He didn't hesitate. He just gave it. And this story became proverbial in Tibet to illustrate that when someone has a lot, he wants more. And when someone has less, he is prepared to give. So, first, what's very interesting to me is the narrative here of two brothers, one possessing very little, the other possessing a lot. And what the brother who possesses a lot makes that mean. Consumption, this idea of consuming, because the more that we own, the more that we can control, the more that is ours, the happier we'll be. Well, at least one could argue that the idea that we form, this belief that we form that our worth can be measured by what we possess, is a very complex story. It obviously begins at some very early stage of our conscious development. As the mind is developing, there's clearly a moment we experience some trauma, some moment where there's vulnerability. Now, maybe this isn't absolutely true. Maybe we aren't vulnerable and we simply experience the feeling of being celebrated for having something, or the feeling of power associated with possession of something. And of course, that could start very young. It's a very easy circumstance to imagine. You're young and you possess something, and the possession of that gives you a certain power, or the possession of that gives you a certain stature amongst your friends. The possession of something gives you leverage, or it gives you attention. It gives you notoriety. Even as a child, even as a forming, this human being that's forming its identity, could easily adopt such a belief from one simple experience. It could also be that there's a feeling inside of us that we're not enough, that we're vulnerable, that we're unsafe. And because we're unsafe, there's this need to address that feeling. There's a sensation that could be gnawing at us, some, and I say sensation meaning some type of visceral experience in the body of discomfort, which of course again is about not being safe, some stress, some anxiety. And we're looking for solutions, and we find that possession gives us some sense of control, some sense of having an effect on the world around us, that we can actually, with our actions, feel and experience ourselves as having some power in the world around us that ultimately we may feel powerless within. So the motivations that drive a person to possess, could be quite varied. I'm not sure what gets us to this. It could be pain, it could be pleasure, but something has gotten us to form the belief that if we possess, we have certain control, we have certain power, we have certain sensations of happiness or fulfillment. And it could even be said that it's a naturally occurring quality in a human being to want to possess, to want to own have some way of feeling that we matter. And matter is such an interesting word to me in this context, because matter is in, I'm made of matter. Every object is in some way made of matter. This idea of matter as that we can move matter. Does that make sense? Because it's an interesting way to understand this idea that I matter, I am matter, and I can possess this matter, and I can move this matter, and I can take away this matter, I can give this matter. Somehow our ability to manipulate, to move, to in some way use matter as a leverage, as a tool. It's an interesting way we use the term I matter, you matter, we matter. So this possession, this identity of ours that gets somehow entangled with our possessions is something that we all have to look at. We're all, in some way, shape, or form, connected, married to, addicted to, dependent upon what we possess for different reasons. It could be our possessions represent our memories. Our possessions represent current identity from our our stature, our place in society, to where we've come from, and that letting go of that object also means letting go of that memory, because of course we like to be reminded of where we've come from. So it's very complex, the matter. So Rinpoche goes on to say here, so there is, in some way here, the psychology of possessiveness is a psychological hunger. And this is what he's ultimately talking about. And he says this relates not only to money and wealth, but to the deep-seated feelings of wanting to possess, wanting to hold on to things, wanting things definitely to belong to you. So right here, wanting to hold on to things, just as I said before, as though holding on to a possession is the same as holding on to a memory. It seems in so many ways innocent enough that we would want to hold on to a memory. And that possession represents the memory, and letting go of it may also in some way result in the loss of the memory itself. So in some way it seems that we are all inclined to possess. And wanting to definitely I like that he chooses this word, that we want to definitely possess, that we want things to definitely belong to us. That is mine. I can identify that. I can say that's mine. I can certainly understand that. I can certainly understand the feeling of ownership and the pride that then develops out of ownership, and then the stubbornness and the anger, the pain, the rage, the jealousy, that can also develop out of pride of ownership. Being proud to own something is also a justification for killing for it, fighting for it, murdering for it. People have murdered each other for thousands of years over possession of land, possession of property, cattle, food, all understandable. You could explain why one would be justified in killing another person who's trying to take their land, their home, their food. So it's interesting what it brings up. He goes on to say, for example, supposing you are window shopping. One person might be unhappy all the time, and when he sees things he likes, this always produces a kind of pain in his mind because he is thinking, if only I had the money, I could buy that. So all the time, as he is walking through the shops, this hunger produces great pain. Whereas another person may enjoy merely looking. So this wanting to own, wanting to possess, and not being prepared to give out is not really a weakness for any particular thing. It is more generally wanting to occupy oneself with something. And if you have lost or lose interest in that particular thing, then you always want to substitute something else in its place. It's interesting, the analogy of the window shopper. You're walking and this pain that we feel every time we realize we can't have something, if we are deeply connected to possessing things, this wanting all the time to have something that we don't have, which again brings up a very interesting question. Why do we want more and more? Why is what we have never enough? And it's all connected to the payoff of having that next or that new thing. There's some payoff, there's some investment that we get a return on when we possess something new. And that's the interesting question. It's when we find ourselves desiring something new, we ask ourselves why, and for what purpose does it serve? I once, when I was in Los Angeles living, I bought a Porsche. I had always wanted a Porsche as a car. I thought they were incredibly, my uncle, when I grew up, it had a certain nostalgic representation to me. My uncle, my favorite uncle, had always had these Porsches as I was growing up. And I always admired him and admired these beautiful cars that he had. And when I was able to afford one, I bought one. And I don't know that I was really able to afford it, but I bought one anyway. I had $1,000 a month in car payment, something absurd. And yes, the car is amazing. I cannot say to you that a Porsche is not an incredible machine. It's incredible. It does what it does. But the idea also for me was prestige, that it had a certain, it made a certain statement that I had made it, that I had achieved a certain level of success. And when I drove up to my clients' homes in my beautiful sports car, that it said, this guy is worth everything I'm paying him for. And this is a story that I had, and I can very clearly remember telling the story to friends of mine. I had one friend who asked me, why are you spending your money on this? And I said, well, it looks good for my clients, for me to, pull up in this very nice car, and it definitely, it confirms that they're investing into something that's also quite valuable. So it's all this game of perception. And and it's actually quite fascinating, because even to this day, there's still a part of me that says, I don't care what kind of car you drive, but it matters to me how you treat the car you drive. So if you pulled up in a 1972 Honda, little, but it was just super clean and well cared for and beautiful, and that would speak to me in some way, in a different way than if you pulled up in that same car that was rusted and dirty and full of garbage and uncared for. What I would interpret from that, and one could simply interpret that is that could be nothing more than this person does not value cars in any way, shape, or form. They don't value the experience of being in one, being seen in one, the experience of being inside a clean one. So nothing about this matters. And this, of course, really triggers me, as this idea for me that the way you do anything is the way you do everything, and that this individual would treat my personal space that same way. So if this is how you treat your car, how would you treat my car? If this is how you treat your car, how would you treat my home? If this is how you treat your car, how would you treat me as a person? So it's very easy to understand how we could link these things, and I do link them, and then to play with holding a completely different understanding or possibility. If I want to play with competing, contradicting truths, ideas, one could also argue that it is equally accurate to say that this person may treat their own vehicle this way, but may treat everything else in their life with more care, more concern, more sensitivity. And that is absolutely possible. Do I think that it is probable? No, to be honest. But that doesn't make me right. It just simply means that my experience has informed me that the way we do anything is most often the way we do everything. But that doesn't mean it's absolutely true. And so I think it's so important that we're always able to hold these contrasting ideas apart and be honest and sincere in our curiosity, in our investigation of their qualities. Because I may find that, and as I often do, I may find that I am wrong. In this case, I've made a mistake. I am inaccurate in my perception, my opinion, my preference, my belief, whatever it is that I've formed to support my actions. So possession, coming back, that's the Porsche story. So coming back from there and saying that, I can personally attest to having the experience of making a possession mean something about my worth, about my personal value. I can attest to playing that game. I can attest to still playing that game in some way. And as I always say, I don't have the answer. I just simply have questions. And I have questions that I continuously ask myself. One being, why do I believe this? And why do I choose this? And why do I take action in this direction versus that direction? So all of this is a constant state for me. It's not a burden, by the way, in case you're like, that sounds like a lot of mental effort. It's not a burden. It's actually a feeling. I feel quite grateful that I have what is ultimately the privilege and the luxury to even sit with these kinds of questions. But bringing us back to this idea of a society where all things are shared, where you have a very small group of people, an indigenous group of people that live in an egalitarian manner, where all things are just communal and shared. Nothing is really owned. And we start to, if we observe that, we may find ourselves bumping up against, just being in some way disturbed, interrupted by what we have adopted as truth for ourselves in a consumer-driven culture. How would we stop being addicted to consumption, to possession, if we've sold each other the story that our self-worth and our self-preservation depends upon possession and consumption, ownership? If that's the cultural narrative, how would you inspire people to be less interested, less driven to individual ownership if the very notion of not owning and not possessing implies vulnerability? It implies that you are not safe, that you are not socially, your social currency, your value is diminished. How could we possibly change the narrative when there's that much cultural pressure on us to survive and thrive through possession and consumption? And one might arrive at the conclusion that there is no way to change that. There's no possible way to change a society's behavior around possession and consumption if you don't change the cultural narrative that drives everything about our behavior within the culture. Our marketing, our media, our news, our politicians, our celebrities, our art, our music. It's all our food, our beverages. Everything is constantly communicating to us that if we possess this, if we own that, it will improve our position within society. It will improve our beauty. It will improve our desirability. It will improve our ability to attract a partner. It will improve our sexual desires. It will make us more desirable. As long as we continue to culturally propagate, to culturally program our children with this message, we'll never, ever change our behavior, because it's clearly driven by our need to feel secure and safe. And if we don't matter, and if we're not beautiful, and if we're not wanted, if we don't have something that other people want, we're not safe. And we're not desirable. If we're not desirable, we're simply at risk at any time of being outcast somehow, a social pariah, something that is simply, unwanted. So we all want to be wanted. I mean, being wanted is how we simply feel any sense of safety. I'm wanted by my parents, so I'm safe. I'm wanted by my wife, so I'm safe. I'm wanted by my colleagues and my peers, so I'm safe. I'm wanted by my followers, so I feel safe. I always seek to be wanted in order to feel a sense of safety, And culturally, that is what we're selling. So there's absolutely no way that's ever going to change until we stop as an entire culture, as an entire human species, because it's no longer now just simply specific to Western living. The West has now become the world. It's no, when we say Western versus Eastern values, one could argue there's no such thing anymore. It's now all just one way that we are selling each other things, that we are marketing, that we are consuming. So to suggest that you could find this behavior only in one geographical place, one country, one city, one culture is absolutely not true anymore. So to change the entire human species and the way that we are constantly selling each other on what safety is. Safety is consumption. Safety is possession. Safety is ownership. As long as that's the message, there's no likelihood that we will ever interrupt this pattern of egoic, of greed and service to self through the illusion of possession and material, a constant gathering of material, when the absolute opposite of that is to let go, to release, to have less. So there is a move now, and you've probably seen it, minimalism. It's quite a common, I think common is probably not accurate at this point. I hope it becomes common. This idea of minimalism, less is more, really getting rid of this addiction we have to more is more. And you look inside your apartment, your home, your car, your little empire that you've built, this little world that's yours, and you say, what do I have, and why do I have so much, and what is it all for, and what does it represent? And you may find that, this sort of, which I find to be more of a Zen Japanese cultural perspective, which is minimalism. To me, the Japanese culture, it is the original minimalist culture. It's less. Space has very little. Your home has very little in it. It's very basic. This is beautiful. And this is possibly a new movement that may be finding some ground as we swing, as the pendulum of society has swung from having the less to having more means, that I'm worth something. So, to finish with Rinpoche's thought, whereas, so it says, so this wanting to own, wanting to possess is not being prepared to give out. Is not really a weakness for any particular thing. It is more generally wanting to occupy oneself with something. And if you have lost or lose interest in that particular thing, then you will always want to substitute something else in its place. It isn't particularly that you can't manage without a motor car or central heating or whatever it may be, there's always something behind that, something fundamental, a kind of wanting to possess, wanting to own, which is always changing and developing and substituting one thing for another. So he's talking about it doesn't matter what the object is, the why is what's always, that's the culprit. That's what's always at cause. It's why you want to have this or that, because this and that always changes. Today it's this and tomorrow it's that, and then the next day it's another thing. But it's the why. It's this that must be addressed. It must be investigated. And that's the work for us this week, is to look at not only what we possess, not only look at our desire to continuously consume and own and have something that we can definitely say is mine, but why we want that. So the action itself, this urge within us is something to identify, but more one layer beneath that is why. What's driving that? And that's going to be our work for the next, until you die. But we're going to focus on that for this week and make that our homework. So guys, it's been such a pleasure to have you spend some time with me today, even though I know I'm only here virtually, but I am somewhere in the universe right now as you are, and somehow we're connected. So I send you guys love, and I'll see you live in a couple of weeks.